For jaw-dropping historical facts, subscribe to Echoes of the Past. The graphic depictions of violence in war films beg the question, how much of it is based on reality? As you may have seen in Saving Private Ryan, bullets are unable to penetrate water. What if I also told you that civilians, not troops, are the primary targets of war? Check out this video for some stunning realities that you won't hear from Hollywood. The iconic and unforgettable D-Day fight at the outset of Saving Private Ryan is one of the most recognized scenes among the abundance of available war films. A flurry of fast-paced visuals accompanied by the ear-piercing sounds of young men's fatal collapses as they sprint up Normandy Beach. Despite its reputation as one of the most realistic and spectacular war scenes ever, it did take some creative license with the facts. Steven Spielberg says he modified one element for dramatic effect, despite interviewing numerous veterans who were there on D-Day. Needless to say, I'm referring to the bullets that swoop down into the ocean and kill troops long before they hit the beach. However, bullets don't function that way. The error was further reinforced by a popular episode of the show Mythbusters, which refuted the notion once and for all for the audience. Testing numerous firearms, as scientist Professor Gregory Taylor explains, water molecules are packed together considerably more densely than air, meaning it's significantly denser. Despite the bullet acting the same way it would on dry soil, the frequent impacts with the water molecules halt the bullet far more swiftly and long before it reaches its target. Civilian deaths. Most war movies focus on the battle, which is predictable because that's where all the drama and excitement is. Plus, let's face it, it's considerably more entertaining to see someone battle than it is to get helplessly gunned down in the street or die of malnutrition. All of which leads us to the assumption that you are, of course, logically safer back home than on the front lines. With warriors dying all around you and people back home waiting for your return, it's easy to forget that back home, things were truly fairly horrible too. Depending on the historian or paper you read, you'll likely find various casualty counts in everyone, as an exact amount is impossible to calculate due to inconsistent counting and varying categorizations of civilian deaths. However, historian Richard Bessel thinks that at least 60 million people died during World War II. One thing everyone agrees on, though, is that many more perished as civilians than soldiers on the battlefield. Of course, many of these were Holocaust victims, but they were not the only ones to suffer or be killed during the conflict. Famine, sickness, and bombardment also played a key influence in the number of civilians murdered, in figures that reached historic heights as the conflict continued. Bessel argues inhibitions of hitting civilian targets dissolved as the severity of bombs on towns and cities intensified. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, for example, resulted in the deaths of around 260,000 civilians immediately and countless thousands in later life from the consequences of being near the initial explosions. However, there was one individual who both luckily and unluckily ended up in both the blast radius of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, coming away from both reasonably unscathed. Here's to having some of the luck of Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Overall, over the entire planet, it was a terrible and unparalleled attack on civilian life. But the USSR regrettably suffered some of the worst of all, with roughly half of all deaths throughout the war being Soviet people. But in China, conditions were arguably far worse. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937 and continued until World War II's end, was likewise at the forefront of civilian deaths. According to Bessel, the death toll in China alone was anywhere between 10 and 20 million. Whichever way it is sliced, though, the number of Chinese people who died significantly outnumbered those of military deaths and exceeded the total number of war dead the Germans and Japanese suffered combined. Outbreaks of sickness were partly to blame, But the Chinese also experienced constant, repetitive bombings from the Japanese, with 268 hitting the city of Chongqing solely from 1939 to 1941. Furthermore, there were horrendous atrocities committed by the Japanese against the Chinese during World War II, including both biological and chemical warfare. Life in Europe was not much simpler. For example, the Germans also had no qualms with utilizing biological warfare, seeking to generate a malaria outbreak in Italy. And lastly, a great number of men didn't die in action, but as prisoners of war. Bessel again believes over 5 million military deaths took place in captivity, and were the result of neglect, murder, and inhumane treatment as POWs. So, although war pictures focus on the battlefield, what's typically lacking is the loss and damage back home. Forgotten victims of the Holocaust. 6 million Jewish people died in the Holocaust. It's a number etched into many people's brains, and throughout Europe, concentration camps still exist in memorials of those who experienced unspeakable atrocities at the hands of the Nazis. But what's often overlooked are the non-Jewish people who were also reviled by the Nazi authorities. This may be seen across the filmmaking of the Holocaust, which makes little to no mention of the various minorities targeted for annihilation. In The Pianist, for example, there's little focus on homosexuals, Sinti and Roma residents, formerly known by the term gypsy, the physically and psychologically challenged, Black Germans or Slavs, among others who were also vulnerable to Nazi persecution. However, as historian Ian Kershaw notes, these populations were never assaulted or persecuted in a systematic sense like Jewish people and didn't suffer comparable losses. Nevertheless, by ignoring them totally, war films do history and these individuals a disservice in their recounting of the Holocaust. Prildoas, for example, was a Czech citizen imprisoned for helping Jewish individuals in the winter of 1941 and later transported to a work camp before being taken to the Mauthausen concentration camp, categorized as an enemy of the Führer. Along the journey, he observed several Czech inmates gunned down, chosen at random for extermination. Or there was Alex Sowi, a Polish citizen who fled to Warsaw and joined the Polish resistance. After being transferred to Auschwitz in 1943, he later saw several Roma and Sinti seized and gassed. These are only two of the numerous non-Jewish persons who found themselves in concentration camps, but there were countless more who didn't survive to tell the tale. The exact number of other casualties in the Holocaust is unclear. Renowned survivor and self-proclaimed Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal stated that the number of non-Jewish deaths reached 5 million. Still, others have refuted this, with notable Holocaust historian Yehuda Bauer alleging Wiesenthal told him himself that he had made the statistic up. Others, like American scholar Michael Berenbaum, think that the number arose from Wiesenthal's broad conception of the Holocaust, taking on a universalist stance. Nevertheless, these non-Jewish victims ought to be remembered. Kershaw stated that of the 1.1 million slaughtered in Auschwitz, for instance, 100,000 were non-Jewish, not a comparable number, but 100,000 people who died. They were of several groups who, according to Eugene Kogon, were categorized into 4 categories by the Nazis: criminals, inferior races, political opponents, and associates, who may be defined as vagrants, pickpockets, gamblers, wife-beaters, and similar characters. Of those that died in Auschwitz, according to Kershaw, 70,000 were Polish political prisoners. More than 20,000 were Sinti and Roma, then called gypsies. 10,000 were Soviet prisoners of war, and hundreds were homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses. Like Jewish inmates who wore the Star of David, each had their designation. Political prisoners wore red, criminals green with an S, Jehovah's Witnesses purple, asocials black, and homosexuals pink. Occasionally, The Roma and Sinti and those categorized as asocials donned brown instead. The Star of David may have been the most recognizable, but across the Nazi government, many people suffered. And while war pictures are loud, amusing, and devastating, they only represent a little of the full picture.